Hello, I'm Tashawn and this is Legacy Liner. Welcome aboard. So for today's video, we're going to talk about a woman who was very courageous in the face of danger. And her story actually even made a brief appearance in A Night to Remember. So without any further delay, we're going to dig into the story of Edith Evans as requested by one of you. So let's get into it. Edith Evans was born September 21st, 1875 in New York City. I also saw that she was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but based off of a 1909 passport that she did, she listed her place of birth as being New York City, so that's what I'm going to go with. Her father, Cadwallader Evans, was a successful, wealthy lawyer, and her mother, Angeline Burr, was a woman's rights activist. She would have had an older sister, Lena Evans, and she was the second of two daughters. Also, I love that she was born on September 21st because my birthday is September 24th, so she was almost a Libra, but not quite. So, Edith Evans' family came from old money. And when I say old money, I mean her family immigrated to America before it was even considered America yet. They had originally got their wealth from a tanning business from like her grandfathers on back. Right before Edith would have turned 5, her father passed away rather young at the age of 32 in 1880. As far as Edith's youth go, I would say if you've seen the TV show The Gilded Age, that is the perfect representation of what her youth would have been. Because that's the exact era that she grew up in, the exact neighborhood she grew up in, and she would have been about the same age as the daughter of the main character, roughly. She would have grown up in the upper crust New York society. And there's these newspaper clippings of her attending different events and different social functions. And just like most upper crust New Yorkers at the time, she would go summer somewhere else because the summer in New York City could get very hot in the days before air conditioning. A lot of people know that Newport, Rhode Island was a very popular place for New Yorkers to have summer homes and summer mansions in. Some of them you can still tour till this day. But Edith Evans and her sister Lena, they would have went to Sayville, Long Island, because that's where their grandparents lived. So she would have, went back and forth between those two places growing up. She also apparently became good friends with the Vanderbilt family. There's an article from 1895 when Consuela Vanderbilt was getting married where it mentioned that Edith Evans got them a gift. A rather nice gift, actually. It was a crystal flask with gold on it. So Edith was definitely somebody that you would want to have on your wedding registry, that's for sure. Now, like I mentioned, she came from a family of old money. Her family had been in America before it was even considered America. And she was a descendant of Andrew Hamilton. And that's one of the things I find very interesting about Edith is because she had a strong interest in genealogical studies and history. So she would have been the type of person in today's time that would be on Ancestry.com, 23andMe. She would have been the type of person that maybe had a YouTube channel or watched YouTube channels about historical events in history and listening to the stories of people who have long since passed away. She was also a member of the Colonial Dames of America, which was a group of women who were direct descendants of people who came to America before 1776 and played a huge part in the country's creation. Edith Evans never married, and that wasn't really a common thing in that era, but I think the reason why it works for her is because since her father did die when she was so young, I'm sure he left some sort of trust fund or some money behind for her to inherit in his will. And so, unlike a lot of women of that era, she wouldn't have needed to be financially dependent on a husband the way that some of the other women would have. Also, when you combine the fact that her mother was a woman's rights activist, she was probably, I wouldn't say a feminist, but at the very least somewhat ahead of her time with her views on womanhood for the day. At some point during her travels, she went to London. And when she was there, she decided to visit a psychic. And this psychic told her that she should beware of water. Now, it didn't appear that she was an overly superstitious type of person. Nonetheless, she still continued to travel. So it wasn't something that like paralyzed her with fear, but it was something that she kept in the back of her mind. From my understanding, Edith went to Europe, and I guess her original plans was just that she wanted to go to Europe and shop. But while she was there, a relative had passed away. So she went to the funeral and to comfort the family. And that was in England. But before she left, she swung over to France and went to Paris to do some shopping. Well, she ended up deciding that when she headed back, she was going to board the Titanic. And part of the reason that she apparently chose to travel back on the Titanic is because there were some women that she knew. Now, this is the part of the story that I'm not gonna lie, it was my biggest headache trying to figure out, because there's 3 people that it lists her traveling with. And those people are Carolyn Brown, Malvina Cornell, and Charlotte Appleton. Now, these 3 women were sisters. And the story goes that they had a younger sister who passed away. And I have read that Edith was going to Europe to visit them because they were her family members, and it was a funeral and, just grieving. But I also heard that Edith was also already in Europe for her own shopping and whatever. And then when she found out that a family member had passed away, she attended the funeral then. I also heard that she was in Europe to visit a friend, and it just so happens that these 3 women were women that she knew, and they were friends of hers. So I have read so many different versions of this that it has just given me a headache. I don't know exactly the extent of her relation to them. When I tell y'all, it's literally like a ping pong ball. It's like one article, they're her cousins. The other article, she's their niece. One article, they're friends. So I just gave up. It's lost to history on me. If you know their exact relation, comment it below. But just know that I've read all the different versions. And through going through Ancestry and everything else, I was just like, there is no way I'm going to figure this out in time to get this video out in a respectable length of time. Whatever the case is, she knew these 3 women, and she knew them rather well. So nonetheless, on April the 10th, 1912, she boarded a little tender called the Nomadic, and it would have sailed out and waited until it saw the Titanic come over the horizon. The Titanic had an almost collision with a vessel called the New York earlier that day, which caused there to be a delay in its schedule. So her, John Jacob Astor, Margaret Brown, and even some of the second class passengers like the LaRoche family would have been waiting on this tender, the Nomadic, until the Titanic eventually arrived, in which case she would have boarded. And off they headed for their next stop before heading off on out to sea. During her time on the Titanic, she spent most of it with the 3 sisters. One of the cool things about this, though, is that we know that she stayed in cabin A29. And so I went to the blueprints of the Titanic to see what the layout would have been. And she would have been right near the grand staircase. If you were to go up to A deck on the grand staircase on the starboard side, walk past the elevators and past the first hallway on your right, when you got to the second one, that's where her cabin would have been. And I just think that's really cool, because with Titanic Honor and Glory, they have videos where you actually walk by her cabin. You get to see the very corridor that she would have walked through every time she went to dinner, or every time that she left her cabin to go explore the ship or meet with her friends. And I just thought that was very neat. Now, while on board, the 3 sisters that she was hanging out with, they ended up meeting Colonel Archibald Gracie. And him being a gentleman, and this being the Edwardian era, he took these women under his charge. In other words, what that means is he decided to take responsibility for their care and safety, since they were traveling alone without a male companion. And this was a common etiquette of the time, just so you could make sure that the women weren't getting harassed by any of the male passengers or that they weren't being taken advantage of in any kind of way. Some articles will say that he also took Edith into his care during the voyage, but he wouldn't actually meet her until the sinking itself. He himself says that. So they say that he took charge of Edith as well and the group of women, but during the voyage itself, he hadn't even been properly introduced to her. Now, exactly what Edith was doing during the voyage isn't known, but what is known is that on April the 14th, 11:40 p.m., Titanic hits the iceberg. As the ship is sinking, Colonel Archibald Gracie, he gets himself ready and prepared, and then he starts tracking down all of the women that he had taken into his charge. Helen Candy, the three sisters. He had a list of them. He was going around helping everyone. And even James Cameron himself gave a little head nod to this in the movie. There's a scene where Rose and Jack are trying to find a lifeboat, and Rose runs up to him and asks, are there any more boats? And he's like, oh, they're this way, I'll lead you. He's trying to take Rose in as one of his charges as well, but she runs off and leaves him behind. That's actually what he was doing during the sinking, though. He was trying to find all of these women. And he found the three sisters, and since Edith was with this group of sisters, that's the first time that he actually met Edith Evans. The group of them did notice the mystery ship that was out on the horizon, and the men were trying to comfort and reassure the ladies that everything was okay, that mystery ship out there was most likely heading to them. And it was during this time that Edith informed Colonel Archibald Gracie about the prophecy that the psychic told, foreshadowing her being out at sea. And of course, Colonel Archibald Gracie, trying to comfort what he saw as a damsel in distress, he was telling her, don't worry about that. That's not true. Psychics make things up all the time. Just trying to get that thought out of her mind. But Edith reassured him that, she remembers that and that must be her fate. And it's not that Edith was looking at this as, oh, this is it, I'm dead, it is what it is. It's just one of those things where she was like, oh my God, the psychic warned me about this, and look, it's happening. It was that type of thing. Now, I can't tell you exactly when it happened in the night, but somewhere in the night, the group of women got split apart. And so the other women had already gotten into a lifeboat, but it was Edith Evans and Carolyn Brown who were the two left behind on the Titanic. He escorted Edith Evans and Carolyn Brown to Collapsible D, and they were loading this lifeboat, but by this point it was late enough in the sinking where people were starting to realize that their lives might actually be in danger and the ship is actually sinking. So by this time they had to try to stop the men from swarming the boats. And the way that they did this is that they had the crew members lock arms with one another and create like this human chain. And they would only let women and children through that chain. Well, Colonel Archibald Gracie, he's escorting Edith Evans and Carolyn Brown to the boat. And then he gets to this human chain that's been formed by the crew. So they let Carolyn Brown through and Edith Evans through, but they won't let him go. So at this point, he realizes that, okay, they're in line for the boat. I've done all I can. So now he walks off to go look for other women that he can help escort to the lifeboat. So you have Collapsible D, and then you have a group of women and children waiting to board it, the crew members blocking the men off, and then the crowd of everyone else. Edith Evans and Carolyn Brown are in queue to get into this lifeboat. Well, when it gets to be their turn to board, one of the crew members shout, "I have only room for one more." And with absolutely no hesitation, Edith Evans turns to Carolyn Brown and says, "You go. You're married and you have children." She then pushed Carolyn Brown forward. She got into the lifeboat, and Edith Evans stayed behind on the sinking Titanic. As Collapsible D was being lowered into the water, William Lucas, who is one of the men who was put into the boat to row it, he shouts up to Edith Evans and says, "There will be another boat for you." Not long after this, Edward Brown reported that Collapsible A was being prepped to be loaded and lowered, and there was about 4 or 5 women who were waiting for their turn to be loaded into this lifeboat, but they were trying to get it ready. During this time, Titanic began its final plunge. And so Collapsible A was a lifeboat where it wasn't properly lowered. It was a matter of whoever could crowd into the boat at the last minute were the ones that managed to make it in. If you've ever seen the movie Titanic, Collapsible A is the lifeboat that Cal escapes in. And you know that scene where he gets into the boat, but then the boat flips over and then it straightens itself out again, and people are dumped into the sea and have to climb back in? That's really happened. And that's the lifeboat that Edith Evans managed to crawl into. And since Collapsible A was swamped so badly, you couldn't just sit in it the way that everyone else could. You had to stand to try to keep it balanced, to keep it from overturning. Because a collapsible lifeboat means that the sides of the boat are made out of canvas. So it's not like the wooden lifeboats that were solid wood all the way down. The sides of the boat were made of this canvas and had to be lifted up and stuck down with these posts that held it in place. But since the ship sank so rapidly and it was so chaotic with this boat getting off, it was swamped. And so it was not very stable. It rocked very badly. And so the passengers on board, they had to stand and kind of counterbalance the best that they could to keep the boat from getting swamped. Well, as the night progressed, people began to give in to exposure. And George Reams, he reported that Edith Evans was one of the people in the boat. And throughout the night, he was trying to give her words of encouragement. He was telling her things, like, don't worry, their help is on the way, that ship we saw is on the way. I'm sure he was just telling her whatever he could to try to lift her spirits. But unfortunately, he noticed that she just was slumping, slouching, more and more and more, until eventually she gave out. And the reason that they knew this is because when she slumped over, she fell into the bottom of the boat, which had water in it. So it was obvious that at this point, she was gone. The morning came and the sun rose, or were beginning to rise. The water got a little bit choppier, and one of these waves just washed over the boat, got her body, and washed it away. Edith Evans passed away at the age of 36. She was one of the 4 first-class women to die on the Titanic. Colonel Archibald Gracie ended up surviving the night. And when he made it on board the Carpathia, one of the things that he decided to do was go check on all of the women that he had under his charge the night before. He just wanted to check and make sure that nobody fell overboard or nothing happened in the lifeboats, that all of the women made it on safely. And much to his disappointment, he realized that Edith was not amongst the survivors. And this is something that bothered him pretty badly. So much so that he decided to confront Second Officer Charles Lightoller, because Lightoller was one of the officers in command of lowering the lifeboat that Edith and Carolyn Brown had went to earlier that night. And when he confronted Officer Lightoller about this, Lightoller just said, "We didn't see any other women," or at least that he didn't. And so that was that. When it comes down to Edith's sacrifice, it did not go unappreciated. Once on land, Carolyn Brown made sure that she informed the world of Edith's sacrifice and bravery. There were newspaper articles from the time circulating around telling the story of Edith's sacrifice. On April 22nd, a week after the sinking, Carolyn Brown stood in front of a crowd at the Grace Church in New York City and she openly wept as she uttered these words. It was a heroic sacrifice, and as long as I live, I shall hold her memory dear as my preserver, who preferred to die so that I may live. A plaque was dedicated in her honor in that very church, and is still there till this day. St. Anne's Episcopal Church in Sayville, Long Island, the place where she would have spent her summers as a young girl, they also dedicated a tablet in her honor. There's a organ, I think, in this same church that was dedicated in her grandfather's honor. Her and her sister presented it, I think, in like the 1880s, 1890s. So it's fitting that she has a memorial there along with her grandfather. Edith Evans was a woman who was all about history, lineage, where she comes from, and her legacy. And here on Legacy Liner, we are more than happy to keep the story of Miss Edith Evans and her selfless sacrifice alive. So, that's my video on Edith Evans. This was a request by one of my subscribers. I'm gonna be honest with you, sometimes when I get requests, don't think that I don't see them. It's just that it takes me a little while sometimes to research stuff. A lot of these stories have like multiple versions of them, and I'm trying to like compare and contrast, and it can be a bit much. But I do see your comments, and I do be writing it down, and I'm taking notes on them, I promise. But that's my video on Edith Evans. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching my video. Y'all have a good one.